Thank you. Yes, I'm thrilled to be here. I've spoken several times at the events by the Finnish Migration Institute, and so I'm honored to be, I guess, the keynote speaker at this event. This is the contents of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to talk a little bit about Nordregio. I know some of you know about us, others maybe a little bit less so, and I'll talk about our institute briefly and some of the research that we do on migration and integration issues in the Nordic countries. I'll talk a little bit about some of the key research questions and policy questions regarding migration in Finland and the Nordic countries, a little bit about some of the recent migration trends. Some of the previous speakers have highlighted a little bit of this, but I'll go into a little bit more depth. Talk a bit about some of the foreign origin populations in Finland and the other Nordic countries, and then talk about some of the policy responses. And then hopefully conclude. So Nordregio, that's the short name. The long name is the Nordic Center for Spatial Development. This is our office. If you've ever been to Stockholm, it's on the lovely island of Skeppsholmen in the middle of Stockholm. We're an institution under the Nordic Council of Ministers with a mandate to do policy-oriented research for the Nordic Council of Ministers, but also local governments, national governments in the Nordic region. And we try to enhance Nordic value added, meaning kind of comparative among the Nordic countries. I mean, there's kind of a common welfare model, common economic systems, and try and enhance some of that. We have 4 different kind of research themes that we focus on. Obviously, demography, social welfare is kind of where migration fits into that. We do quite a bit on urban planning, sustainable development, green growth, and also we do a fair bit, because of where we're located, on the Arctic. The geographical focus, obviously the Nordic countries, the Arctic, the Baltic Sea region, and we also get a fair bit of funding. I also do quite a bit of research on Europe. I have a couple of Horizon 2020 projects, one looking at regional development, another one starting up pretty soon on future migration scenarios in Europe, kind of a big modeling exercise. We'll bring, hopefully, our Nordic expertise to that. I just want to highlight some of the publications that we do on the areas of migration and integration. This publication on the left, actually I have one copy sitting over there on the table and some policy briefs, so you are welcome to take any of those. All of these, and I'll give our website later on, you're welcome to download and look at any of these. The one on the left was a recent publication looking at integrating migrants into the Nordic, basically labor markets, looking kind of topic by topic, looking at different migrant groups and how they can be better, more quickly integrated. The first speaker from the government talked about the need to kind of integrate people, get them into the labor market, and we've done quite a bit of research on that and what works, what doesn't work. On this other one, the Nordic Economic Policy Review a couple of years ago, took kind of a country-by-country look at migration and integration issues. Again, kind of what works, what doesn't. Some of these I've contributed to, some of my colleagues have, some of the Nordic Council of Ministers. The one on the left looked at specifically at refugees and the kind of difficulties and issues surrounding refugee integration into the labor markets. This is a publication of mine looking at, and I'll present some findings from this. It's kind of a broad statistical overview of international migration trends over the last 20 or 30 years. And then we also did, that project was called From Migrants to Workers, so it was 2 parts. One was the kind of, broad statistical overview, but one was some case studies specifically of how local communities, especially in rural areas, integrate migrants into their labor markets. Another one on kind of a knowledge overview of refugee integration. A publication that we put out every other year is called the State of the Nordic Region, and this is the most recent one was launched in February of 2018. So we look at the economy, the labor force, demographic developments in the Nordic countries, and I, for the last couple of editions of this, have had the task of writing about migration issues in the Nordic countries. I'm given 3,000 words to describe the trends, the policies, and the impacts of migration, which is a rather difficult task. And actually the next one, we're actually in the process of writing it and doing the research for it. It'll be launched early next year. And because of the importance of migration, certainly over the last, say, 4 years during this refugee, whatever you want to call it, crisis. Whenever I use the term refugee crisis, I always get criticized. But this large wave in 2015, 2016 into the Nordic countries. Anyway, because of the importance that we did kind of a special issue on migration and integration, kind of pulling out from each of the chapters the kind of most salient issues around migration and integration in the Nordic region. So all of these are available for download on our website. So some of the key issues, some of the key policy issues regarding migration and integration into the Nordic region. And I start with this. This is a quote from this special issue on integration and immigration. Managing migration is one of the most complex challenges for politicians and societies in our time. And Thomas, in his very nice overview of the Finnish Migration Institute, but certainly also Finnish migration, like he said, it was primarily, the Institute primarily studied Finns and others moving out of Finland, but starting in the 1990s, there was more and more people coming into Finland. So for Finland, this is kind of a new issue, people coming into the country. I think it was when it was in the 1980s, Finland went from being a country of emigration to being a country of immigration. I think some of the other Nordic countries have had a bit longer history of migration into those countries, and it's been much more sizable. Certainly Sweden has a much longer history, but this is a challenge, like I said, for any country to kind of balance all the newcomers into the country and to deal with them. You can probably tell my accent. I'm from the United States. I've been at Nordregio, living in Sweden for about 4 years now. So I thought before I kind of get into all the issues with Nordic migration, I'll take a little detour and talk a little bit about the United States and our migration history. I showed, this is U.S. immigration policy then and now. These two images, the one on the left you probably well recognize, the Statue of Liberty. A lot of people from Finland, the other Nordic countries, as Thomas said, immigrated in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and either literally or figuratively passed by the Statue of Liberty on their way into the United States. The image on the left is probably this fellow is probably less well known to most of you, known maybe to some of you. This is a fellow named Stephen Miller, and he is a senior advisor to the current president of the United States. And if you hear of the Muslim ban in the United States, building a border wall, any type of restrictions on migration, requiring new immigrants to have health insurance before they come in the country, any kind of anti-immigration policy that the current administration espouses probably has his fingerprints put on it. He's an extremely powerful person. I mean, he's definitely got Donald Trump's ear in terms of migration and all of the things that he espouses. So what's gone on in the United States? Again, Thomas gave a kind of long history of emigration from Finland, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about immigration to the United States and kind of what's gone on in order to provide some context for the recent trends and policies in the Nordic countries. This shows the foreign-born population in total and as a percent of the population in the United States. going back to the 1860s. And you see here, if you focus on the yellow line in the during this wave of migration from the Nordic countries, other European countries, the percent foreign born in the United States fluctuated, but it was generally around 13, 14%. There was various restrictions put on, and I'll talk about those in a second, in the 1920s, and the percent foreign born began to decline rather considerably. And then in 1970, it reached kind of a low. It was about, the percent foreign born was about 4%. And this is, in the history of the United States, this was a historic low. And this was actually when I was a child, and I certainly saw this. I mean, we didn't talk about, foreign populations or anything like that because there weren't that many. But then there was other changes in legislation, and the foreign born began to grow, and it's taken off, I guess you could say, in the last 30 or 40 years, and we're actually approaching the levels. It's about 13, 14%. It's approaching the levels that it was during the Great Migration in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and yeah, I guess some of this is the backlash you see is this rise in the number of immigrants. And this shows, and I'll show a comparative chart from the Nordic countries, this shows the change in the percent foreign born by county in the United States. And the greener means the higher increase in the number of foreign born people. And you can see from most of the United States, it's some shade of green, meaning the percent the percent foreign born has in some places doubled in certain counties in the United States. And this is for some people or for some smaller counties in the United States, they were almost 100% American born, and so it's been a bit of a surprise. All of a sudden you have Vietnamese kids showing up in school, people from other places showing up in the workplace, and so it's been a bit of an adjustment. I mean, for some people this is wonderful, it's great. Others it's not considered so great. And there's very few, if you can see the pink, there's very few places where the percent foreign born has declined over this period. For most places it's actually gone up quite a bit. And I'll just take a very brief run through of U.S. immigration laws over time, the 1700s and up to mid-1800s. I mean, migration to the United States was rather free. People could come. They became a citizen within a couple of years. 1892, Ellis Island was opened. Like I said, some 40% of Americans can trace their ancestry to somebody who came through Ellis Island. And this was the wave of the Great Migration to the United States, where percent foreign born was quite high. And then it was after that, 1903, was the first migration restriction actually based on individuals. You can see here some of the terminology. Political extremists, beggars, epileptics, and this is actually what the law said. 1921 was the beginning of quotas. It caps on the number of people who come to the United States, but also quotas based on national origin. So if you had X number of people in the United States from a country at that time, I think it was 3% could come in, from that country could come in any particular year. And this was really designed to allow people from Northern Europe, Finland and those countries, and to exclude people from some of the Southern European countries. But it had the effect of lowering overall migration. 1942, during the war, was the first, the Bracero program, where there was labor shortages, and we started to allow people from Mexico and other places to come, quote unquote, temporarily. And this is where the term, there's no such thing, there's nothing as permanent as a temporary migrant, but this is when these people started to come, and the deal was come for a couple of years, work, and then go back, and we see how well that works. 1965, the national origins limits, or was abolished, but there was still limits. And what the effect that this had was to change the country of origin of people coming to the United States. So less people from Europe, more people from Asia, China, and places like that. And again, because you had this, and again, I'll gloss over some of the details, but because you had so many people coming illegally, or they overstayed visas or things like that, you had this large undocumented migration. It was in 1986 we had something called IRCA, the Immigration Reform Act, where we said, okay, those who are here, we'll allow you to become citizens or permanent residents, and then we'll basically not allow other people to come. And this also, at this time, we started to put the burden of proof of being illegal or undocumented on on employers, so any workers that they hired. And you could almost say 1986 was the last time we had any meaningful national immigration reform in the United States. If there's one thing that liberals and conservatives in the United States probably agree on, is that migration policy in the United States is broken. What they don't agree on is how we should go about fixing it. And certainly under the current administration, the ascendancy is people restricting migration. 2005, again, kind of this putting the onus on employers of not being able to check people's immigration status. Under Obama, there was this DREAM Act where a lot of the children who were brought, unbeknownst to them, to the United States as children by parents who are illegal migrants, they were allowed to stay in the United States under certain circumstances. And this was an executive order. It was not something passed by legislation. I think there was about 850 children who were affected by this. And then certainly in the last years under Donald Trump, I mean, it's been, the emphasis on building the wall and other restrictions on migration. So anyway, so keep some of this in mind as I talk about the Nordic countries. Here what I show is from a paper, a simulation that a colleague of mine and I did. And what this shows in the orange bars is the age structure of the Nordic populations without migration, and the white or the black outline shows if there was continued in-migration to the Nordic countries, what the age structure would look like. And because the fact that migrants tend to be of a younger and a different age structure than the native populations, they can it has the effect of lowering the age structure, the average age of the population. And like I say here, while migration cannot stop the aging process, it can boost the labor forces and to slow down the aging population in the short run. But some of the issues, and I think the first speaker highlighted some of these, the Nordic populations are aging. There is, some people think, or a lot of people think, there's a need to have a migrant population to continue to secure a labor force. But because of the social welfare model in the Nordic countries, these people have to come in and be put into work rather soon. And that applies not just to people, but both genders. I mean, the Nordic countries, of course, have a high female labor force participation rate, and that has to continue. And this just shows for a couple of the Nordic countries the difference. The dark ones are the native populations, and then the lighter shades are the foreign populations. So you can see here that the foreign-born populations are quite a bit younger than the native populations. And this map, and again, I think the first speaker alluded to this, this map shows over a 5-year period the effect of international migration at the municipal level in terms of population growth. And so the regions in green are those regions that would have grown whether they had international migration or not, okay? And those in red are those regions that would have lost population regardless of international migration. But the interesting ones are those regions in yellow, which is about a quarter of the regions in all the Nordic countries, are those that only would have grown in population because of international migration. And so there's I've been to a lot of different regions, municipalities across the Nordic country, and a lot of them are trying to get people, to encourage people to move to their municipality or region. And like I said, one issue is not just to get people, but to get them into employment as quickly as possible. And I showed just one chart, but this hierarchy of natives having the highest employment rate, foreign-born having a less high employment rate, and certainly migrants from outside the EU 20. I guess we're still EU 28, isn't it, for a couple more days. Outside the EU 28 have a lower employment rate. And certainly you can break this down by status. I mean, how people came to the Nordic countries. You can certainly break it down by gender, with men having higher employment rates than women do. So some of the recent trends in migration in the Nordic region, I think maybe this was alluded to also. I mean, obviously there's been a large increase in migration over the last 20, 25 years, but certainly more recently, the last decade and a half, there's been a large increase in the number of people coming into the Nordic countries. Shows for all the 5 largest countries. You can see the big upswing in 2015, 2016, during this big wave of refugees and asylum seekers coming to this region. And what this shows is kind of the importance of migration to population change. And this is for all of the Nordic countries. So what this shows is the blue shows natural increase, so the difference between births and deaths, and then the red shows net migration, so the difference between in-migration and out-migration. And you can see here, I don't know if I have a pointer, but you can see here since about 2006, I mean, migration has been by far the biggest component of population increase in the Nordic countries. You can see the huge spike in 2015, 2016 has gone down a bit since then, but it's still quite high. And then because we're here in Finland, I'll show this also for Finland and kind of what's gone on over the last almost 30 years. And I think Thomas again alluded to this, the fact that over the last 3 or 4 years in Finland, there's been more deaths than births. The fertility rate is, I think, at a historic low in Finland right now. And so it's any additions to the population of Finland are coming about because of net migration, not because of any more population or natural increase of the population. And another trend that's gone on over the last several decades is there's been a shift in the countries of origin of migration to the Nordic countries. And this shows in the 1990s what we call the major flows of migration into the Nordic countries. And you can see in the 1990s, a lot of the migration that took place in this period was between or among the different Nordic countries. So Finland to Sweden and back and forth like that. A little bit of migration from the United States, but some of this was probably due to actually return migration of people. And then if we go to the 1990s, you're starting to see the first emergence of Iraq being a major sending country to the Nordic region. And also this is the period when Poland and the other countries became EU members. The Nordic countries opened up their labor markets and Poland became a major sending country. And then if you go forward to the 2010s, I mean, you can see even more, some of the other refugee sending countries became major source countries. Syria, Iraq, I mean, you can see those, especially to Sweden more so than some of the others. And I can show this again for Finland. I mean, you can see here Estonia, Russia were major sending countries, and this kind of stays the same for Finland. The 2000s, the 2010s, you see kind of the same flows, even though there has been, in more recent years, increased refugee people coming in under those conditions. And this shows the number of asylum seekers by month over this 2014 to 2017. The huge peak in the fall of 2015. And like I said, I always hesitate when I write refugee crisis, but anyway, and this is actually about the time I moved to Sweden, and I was given the task of studying migration in the Nordic countries, and I think a lot of people didn't quite realize what was going on at that time, and the real extent of the refugee flows or asylum seeker flows into the Nordic regions. And another issue with integration, migration, is and I didn't come in as a refugee, by the way, I should preface that. But you can see here, this shows for Sweden the categories of migration and how this has changed over time. And the orange, or I guess it's orange, the mustard yellow color, shows the number of people who came in as one of these refugee humanitarian statuses. And you see the kind of small numbers in late 2000s, and then up more recently, there's been kind of an increase in the number of people who have come in under some sort of refugee status. So these aren't people who are coming from Poland who have a job upon arrival. These are people who, had a lot of them rather difficult journey. People who don't speak the same language, who would go through some sort of integration program. The same situation is true for Norway. You can see here that kind of orange is people came in under some sort of refugee status, and that number or percent went up rather considerably. And then the same for Finland here. I guess it's the blue. For Finland, 2016, a lot of people coming in under some sort of refugee or asylum seeker status. So that was a little talk about some of the flows. We can talk about the foreign populations. Obviously, in all these countries, the foreign-born population has gone up rather considerably. And this is, like I said, somewhat new to the Nordic countries. It's certainly a new phenomenon in Finland, which, like Thomas said, the Institute has almost gone from studying out migration to studying in migration to these places. But you can see places like, all of the countries, but certainly Sweden has a rather large foreign-born population. And then you can see here that I show this in percent terms. In Sweden, I think now has close to 18 or over 18% of the population is foreign-born. So 1 in 5 people almost is foreign-born. And even Finland has gone from like 1.3% foreign-born to about 7% foreign-born today. And then to put this into somewhat comparative terms, we call this the age of migration, but only about 3% of the population of the world lives outside of their country of birth. But I show over time, and then you can see here Sweden. Sweden has a higher percent foreign-born than the United States does now, and it's kind of rivaling countries, overseas countries that have been traditional receivers of migrants like Canada and Australia. And some of the other Nordic countries are kind of comparable, or have become comparable to some of these countries that have a much longer history of being migration receiving countries. And I won't belabor this, but I mean, the point is, the Nordic countries, surprisingly, for all we talk about Nordic integration and things, actually define foreign-born or foreign origin populations quite differently. But the point is, and I'll show this for all 5 of the Nordic countries. Up in the top left is Iceland, and the blue bars show those people with no foreign no foreign background at all. And then the other shades are people with some sort of foreign background. Either they were born abroad, their parents were born abroad, or something like that. But you can see here the trend is in Iceland, increasing number of people have some sort of foreign origin. Same thing is true with Norway. I mean, Norway actually has probably the best and most detailed data to go back 3 generations, looking at parents born abroad, grandparents born abroad. Sweden now has about 30% of the population has some sort of foreign origin, either born abroad or parents born abroad. Finland, again, smaller numbers, but for Finland, it's kind of a new phenomenon. Increasing shares of the population were born abroad. Same thing is true in Denmark. So like I say here, I mean, this has become, the Nordic countries have become much less homogeneous than they were just several decades ago. And it's something that they, let me skip that one. Anyway, so if we look at the regional level, or the regional or municipal level, this shows the percent foreign born in 1995, 2005, and 2015. And you can, and it's in this, it's hard to see, but the scale is the same. So if you think back to that map that I showed of the counties in the United States, I mean, you have counties in the United States where you have no foreign born, and then, gradually over time, you have an increasingly foreign born population. And you can see here for the regions or the municipalities of the Nordic countries, you're starting to see an increasing number of foreign born people. The migrant population is they certainly go to the big cities, but they're also kind of spreading out everywhere across the Nordic countries. And then this kind of collects those and shows the percent change in the foreign born between 2005 and 2015. And you can see there's been an increase in almost every region. It's only some regions in Finland where there's actually been a decrease in the percent foreign born over time. So this is something not just at the national, but at the regional level, municipal level, that people have had to accommodate to. I mean, both pros and cons. And just to go through a few large populations, this shows the location of the Polish population in the Nordic countries. You can see here some of the big cities is where they've gone to. Certainly quite a few have gone to Iceland. I mean, Iceland has a rather large Polish population. Those born in the Philippines, Thailand, or Vietnam, you can see again smaller numbers, but gone to the big cities. And then those born in Russia, other countries of the former Soviet Union, obviously Finland, where they've gone to in the much larger numbers, and Helsinki in that area. This map is something that a colleague of mine put together. Maybe it takes a little bit of explaining. This shows the largest minority population in each municipality, and it's based on place of birth, because the Nordic countries don't classify people on race or anything like that. And what the different shades show is the percent that population makes up of the municipal population. Okay, so the darker the shade, the higher the percent is of people from that country. And so the blue shades in northern Sweden are people who were born in Finland. So there's been quite a bit of cross-border migration over time and more recently, so there's a large Finnish population, and also around the Stockholm area, Stockholm, Uppsala, there's large Finnish populations. So they're the largest minority population, people born in Finland. And you can see here the green is people born in Sweden, make up the largest minority population in large portions of Finland. Kind of no surprise there. There's been labor migration, what we call love migration, and people moving back and forth. The blue shades are those people born in Russia or the former Soviet Union, and obviously in large portions of southeast Finland, it's people from that part of the world who are the largest minority population, but they're not, surprisingly, they don't make up that much of the population of any municipality. The two that are kind of interesting, the different shades of yellow or mustard are the people from the EU accession countries, predominantly Poland, but also Latvia, Lithuania. And like I said, in Iceland, the Polish population makes up, some of these municipalities in Iceland are rather small, so you get 30 or 40 Poles moving in. It can boost the municipal population quite a bit. And then, they make up a large portion of the population in places in Norway. The different shades of red are people from Somalia, those places that have had civil wars or whatever you want to call it over the last few decades, or actually more recently. And so those places in different shades of red are where these refugee populations have gone and they've settled. So you see here large portions of southern Sweden, people from Somalia, Eritrea, Afghanistan, etc., make up large portions, in some cases more than 10% of the municipal population. So this is, again, a rather new phenomenon that these, at the national but also the regional municipal levels have had to accommodate. So some of the policy responses to these large flows, it's been kind of varied. There's been like I said, I don't want to make a perfect comparison between what's gone on in the United States and what's gone on in the Nordic countries, but you do have these kind of different reactions to diversity. Like I said, there's been large efforts, a lot of the research that we've done is to try and integrate people into the Nordic countries. You can become integrated in a lot of different ways, but the primary one that people focus on is to get a job, to get into the labor market, to become part of the kind of the Nordic welfare system. And there's been, like I said, a lot of efforts at both the national and regional municipal levels to speed up this integration, to get people jobs, to teach them the language, etc. But at the same time, there's been the rise of these anti-immigration parties, which now have a number of seats in the different parliaments. There was an election in Sweden last fall, and it took 4 months to form a government because the Sweden Democrats kept wanting their say in the government platform. And there's certainly been efforts to reduce the flows or to better control the flows of migrants. And I show the Öresund Bridge between Sweden and Denmark, which now apparently there's border checks going both ways. Recently, there has been quite a while going into Sweden, but now apparently there's checks going the other way. So bring your IDs the next time you cross this bridge. I'll talk a little bit about some case studies that myself and some colleagues did, looking at some of these smaller, more rural municipalities and how they go about the whole process of integration. And like I said, for a lot of these places, it's a rather new phenomenon to have refugees or asylum seekers or just migrants in some of these places. And like I say, I show here the 6 different places where we did these case studies, including Muuttoliikesymposium, which is somewhat close to here. Yeah, and this shows some pictures from this. Has anybody ever been to this place? I suppose somebody. No? Wow, okay. It is really at the end of the road. You don't pass through this place, you go to this place. It's not on the way to anywhere, but it's a nice community. I think the municipality has 3,000 people, and the actual town itself has about 800 people. And the main industry, because it's in the forest, but anyway, one of the main industries is they make coffins. And so this is a coffin assembly factory. There's one of the largest coffin producers. They do have a refugee resettlement center there also, which is opened and closed at various times over the last 20 or so years. It opened up in the 1990s when all the refugees from former Yugoslavia came, then it closed down, then it reopened again. And this is a Syrian family that was resettled to Pucaline. The father is from Syria, and he knew how to drive heavy equipment, and so this is an agricultural place, so he was placed there, and he was a quota refugee, so that each of the countries has a certain number that they take under the UNHCR, but then there's all sorts of other people come in as asylum seekers. So another place we went to is Jämtland in the north of Sweden, and this is a place where, again, you have a number of refugees, asylum seekers, and this woman is the integration coordinator. So in each of the places we went, there was always somebody who, I mean, these people come in, they don't have professional networks, social networks, and so the integration coordinator kind of substitutes until they start to get networks built up. The integration coordinator helps them find jobs and their needs. Isafjordur in the northwest of Iceland, which is a beautiful place. There's Isafjordur, and then there's a number of smaller villages, I guess you can call them, 200-300 people, usually based on one fish processing plant. And here it's Polish people coming in rather large numbers. In fact, the grocery store had a whole separate wing for Polish food, for people who long for Polish food. They would actually get more people. There's actually a shortage of housing in these places. So they work in kind of different skills. I mean, the fish processing plants are a rather low-skilled job, and then the Polish welder here. Buda and Herøy in Norway, same thing. People coming in, working in the fishing tourist industry, and we talked to a woman in the human resource department. She said, we asked her about recruiting. She said, I don't have to recruit. I hire one Polish worker and 10 more show up at the door the next day. So, I mean, there's quite a demand for labor in these places. So some of the observations that we took away from these different case studies, and each of these places we were there for 2 to 4 days, interviewed people in municipal governments and schools and labor offices, and talked to, in some cases, migrants themselves. Language was always cited as something that was quite important for integration, for advancement in your career. And in some cases, people need to come in and learn the basic language, but if they go into healthcare or something else, there's a whole specialized vocabulary that they need to learn, and this is sometimes difficult in some of the smaller settlements. Housing there was always a mismatch. I mean, I think it was talked about this kind of rural to urban migration that's been going on over decades in some of the Nordic countries. So there's a bit of a mismatch. There's sometimes housing available, but no jobs, or jobs but no housing in these places. So that's an issue. Some of these people, especially those who've come on as refugees or asylum seekers, and who came from outside of Europe, it's hard to validate their skills. They can say, okay, I did X, Y, or Z in my home country, and can you prove it? Can we really see what your background is to be able to kind of match it to the labor market? Like I said, this integration coordinator was somebody who was quite important. There's been a couple of studies done recently by the OECD and others on integration. In the Nordic countries, typically, if you look at the systems that they have in place for trying to integrate people, the Nordic countries tend to come out quite high. I mean, they have the programs in place, the policies are there, but sometimes the results are not always there. And this study put the Nordic countries into a group, saying these are countries with large numbers of humanitarian migrants, and large number of migrants recently, many of them coming in under humanitarian circumstances. The integration policies are strong and rather long-lasting. And this shows kind of for the OECD and EU countries, the differences in employment rates between native-born and foreign-born populations. And you see where the differences between those two, and I've highlighted that the Nordic countries tend to be among the highest, and that the unemployment rates are also the gap between native-born and foreign populations. I mean, because in the Nordic countries, the Nordic welfare model rests on having high employment, and high employment of both men and women. The native population, or the foreign populations tend to differ, have much lower employment rates than the native populations. So like I said, there's been large numbers. The humanitarian migrants kind of struggle to integrate. Yeah, and the immigrants are represented at both ends of the spectrum. So you have low status or low educated immigrants, and also highly educated people at the same time. So I'll conclude by saying, and I think this was alluded to also, migration, because for various factors, internal and external factors, is likely to continue into the Nordic countries into the future. I think Thomas used one of the slides from the Nordregio report showing this, but if you just look at the basic population projections of the statistical offices, but also, I mean, the fact that there's been this recent migration, so diaspora populations, tend to attract others from those countries. There's a lot of unintended consequences for migration policy. You can certainly see this in the United States. I mean, there's unintended consequences for all types of social policy, but I think more so for migration. Like I said, the temporary population that was brought into the United States ended up staying, and nobody foresaw that. I mean, like I said, integration certainly in the Nordic countries will remain a challenge. And some of the conclusion of the studies that myself and others at Nordregio and the Nordic Council have done is that there's no silver bullet in terms of integration. There's issues of education, language, so you need some sort of different policies to really fully integrate people. And I finished with this cover of this book called The Diversity Explosion, How Racial Economics Are Remaking America by Bill Fry. And he talks about the challenges of the increasing diversity in the United States, which is a country that's obviously had a much, much longer history of integrating people I wouldn't say integrating, but certainly accepting people into the United States. And I'll conclude by saying maybe it's time we did a similar study for the Nordic countries. So, end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this very informative speech. Now we have plenty of time for discussion because our coffee break will be at 3:15. So I would be happy to take now questions from the floor. And actually, I had myself one point. I was just wanted to ask, what is your interpretation? I paid attention in the first half when you showed slides. There was one of the slides was about unemployment and employment rates in different Nordic countries. And in one of the slides, it said that employment rate in Iceland among the foreign-born was higher than among native-born, and in all other Nordic countries it was lower. And I was wondering, how should we interpret this? How are they doing so much better in Iceland?
Okay. The reason they're doing much better in Iceland is most people come with a job to Iceland. I mean, the Icelandic economy, in spite of the little hiccup a few years ago, is doing quite well. And a much smaller portion of the population comes to Iceland under refugee or any type of humanitarian status. So people come with a job. And so that's why the rate's higher. So.
Sure, thanks. So, other questions? Thomas? try to speak loud.
Thank you. You mentioned the role of the Nordic welfare state as a type of state that might, in a way, it needs high employment rates, but is there something in the system that discourages working? That is not my real point. That was an open question to you. My question is that if we look at what has happened in at least the Finnish labor markets over the past 3 decades, is that availability of those type of jobs that require no or very limited skills to start with is about half of the number than it was earlier. Mm-hmm. And of course, these type of low-skilled workplaces are those places where any new people entering the labor market, students, young people, less educated, some of the migrant groups. So do you see that there is something in the way how our societies function as post-industrial service-oriented societies, that in itself might be something for challenge to integration, or have you seen any of these sort of speculations when you've been touring around the Nordic countries?
Yes. Yeah, a lot of the studies that we've undertaken point to exactly that, the fact that there isn't that many kind of less skilled or almost unskilled jobs. I mean, those have been kind of, I don't know, automated away, and that's a category that immigrants oftentimes undertake, or take at least at the beginning, is low-skilled jobs, and there just aren't that many. And there's no, I mean, when I say active labor market, I mean one of the studies that I showed over there was the fact that most of the Nordic countries don't have a minimum wage. I mean, certainly I know in Sweden there's been a long-standing negotiation between the trade unions and the government, and so I mean, one of the it's kind of funny that one of the suggestions or policy recommendations that was made was that Sweden should almost lower, not the minimum, but lower the lowest wage in order to allow immigrants to come in. And one of the comments, I don't know, somebody made was, well, the fellow who wrote the study, maybe we should lower his wage, but it's a bit of a joke. But yeah, I mean, the fact that there isn't some of these lower skilled entry-level jobs is maybe a barrier to, having higher employment of migrants.
Joanna, you have one question.
Yeah, I would like to ask, what do you refer to with these many unintended consequences of migration policy?
Okay.
Yeah, so the question was about unintended consequences.
Yeah, but unintended consequences, like I said, let me stick to just migration policy. I mean, certainly the one that I referred to, having people come in temporarily, say to the United States or any country, and I mean, it's difficult because then people end up staying. When you have when migration policy kind of gets wrapped up in politics, and you have these competing factions between people who want no migration to build the wall, and people who want more migration into a country, it's rather difficult to conceive a good policy. And certainly, like I said, that's the case in the United States right now. We haven't had any meaningful migration reform in several decades, and it's just difficult to come up with something that's actually would kind of work. And so it would, in the United States, it would probably be better to take migration policy out of Congress, put 10 smart people in a room and have them come up with a policy in terms of border control, in terms of integration. It would probably work a little bit better that way. So hopefully I'm answering your question. But I mean, the other factor is you come up with a policy for a country, but there's all sorts of people outside that country who are impacted by that. And so it's hard to think through all of the consequences of any particular migration policy.
Thank you. Thank you, Timo, for a very interesting presentation. You had this question, demographic potential or problem, and it came to my mind. How do you see this kind of those municipalities, for example, we have here in Finland, which have this negative natural population increase, so there's more than birds, and then they can face negative internal migration balance, and then also they don't get immigrants. How do you see this?
So perhaps I just say for this streaming that the question was about demographic changes and impact on municipalities.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just in a purely demographic point of view, yeah, I mean, these places, I mean, if they want to continue to grow or to not shrink, I mean, yeah, they need to attract immigrants. And I don't know if I can go back. Well, anyway. But yeah, I mean, in my kind of travels around or discussions with local officials, every region wants to have population increase. I mean, it's probably a kiss of death for any municipal leader to say, okay, we want the population to shrink a bit. Even though, you know, to shrink a little bit or to stay the same is probably all right, but I mean, that's the impulse. And that's why there has been some sort of almost place marketing of trying to attract immigrants. And certainly in Sweden, probably more so, I mean, there's been this thought of, okay, we have all this large migrant population coming into the country, let's kind of place them in these places, these smaller kind of shrinking municipalities, where they could be a benefit, not just the total population, but certainly the labor force, because like I said, the fact that this tends to be a younger population than the others. So it can potentially be a boon to some of these smaller municipalities. And I think one thing I didn't quite emphasize, that map that I showed of the largest minority group in each municipality. There's only, out of the 1,200 municipalities in the Nordic region, there's only about 25 where there are no foreign-born people. And they are all in Finland. Which is, I don't want to go back to it, but I mean, that's kind of remarkable that you could have absolutely nobody born outside of the country. So, I mean, these are places where people are just not going to. I mean, migrants are not going to some of these regions at all. So.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for a really interesting presentation. I was thinking about this. For example, in this last slide, there is this. I mean, maybe this is a little bit self-evident point, but in a way that integration as in this last slide, it seems a little bit like as a one-way process, where the kind of stress is very much on integrating them.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, I mean, we know that for example in Finland there is a lot of polls taken that kind of we have serious racism and discrimination issues, but also on policy level that we also have policies. We have policies and programs in place to integrate people, but we also have very strong policies in place to kind of cause insecurity in a way, through work permits, through residence permits, and also, for example, today we heard that the present government is not going to give up this työvoiman tarvehankinta. I don't know what it is. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so I mean, just to make this as a question of how you see this other side of policies.
Yeah. No, thank you for bringing it up. I mean, I maybe I did make it too one way, but I mean, certainly, it goes both ways. I mean, the migrants need to integrate, but also yeah, I mean, for this to work, there has to be some acceptance of all these new people. And, you know, like I said, it can be a positive thing. Some people can view it quite negatively. Certainly the case in the United States, there's this, it's not correct, but I mean, they view it as this competition between, you know, migrants and new people, and between natives and migrants. But yeah, I mean, the integration has to go kind of both ways for it to work. And maybe I did kind of overemphasize the one way, but I mean, like I said, going back to the example of the United States, you're getting places where you didn't have a foreign population 30 years ago, and now you're starting to see that. And the same thing is true in the Nordic countries. There's municipalities where they never heard of anybody from, you know, outside of, I mean, you know, in some places in Norway, a foreigner was somebody from Finland. Now you're starting to see foreigners, you know, Polish and other people from other places. So yeah, but yeah, there also is a bit of a backlash to that, and so that's got to be kind of, it's complex. I mean, yeah, so it's not a good answer, but yeah.
Johanna.
Hi, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I just have one brief comment and a question. First, just as a comment, I have this one slide about American immigration laws over time. And I just wanted to point out that, of course, there's the 1882.
So, striimauksen.
1882, does this work?
Yeah, it's for streaming.
You're just talking.
Chinese Exclusion Act. So
Yeah.
this anarchist act that you mentioned in the early 1900s, kind of like this whole era of exclusion started actually already in the end of the 19th century.
Yeah.
Secondly, you mentioned here in the end this book, Diversity Explosion. And I'm just curious to hear a little bit more. You just mentioned that maybe the Nordic countries should do something like this, but I'm just thinking, like, if you compare the US to the Nordic countries, it's difficult to compare because the way the nations have been formed through immigration, and how the how the idea of the nation is imagined is in the Nordic countries versus the United States. They're very different. So would you be able to tell a little bit more about this book, and if this was done in the Nordic countries, what would it be like in your view?
Yeah, for your first point, I had 2 pages of slides on immigration policy, but yeah, I mean, some of this exclusion came about, earlier. I could have gone on forever. I mean, I pulled those from a table, but yeah, I mean, the Chinese exclusion, yeah, you're right, was a bit earlier. No, what I was saying, the diversity explosion, I mean, the book looks at total numbers, but certainly the role that immigrants play in the U.S. society, U.S. Labor market. Maybe I was pandering for further funding or something, but I'm saying we could do this study and look at the role that immigrants are playing in the Nordic societies, Nordic labor markets. And no, I fully agree with you. I mean, the histories of the Nordic countries versus the United States. I mean, the United States was basically founded as an immigrant country, whereas the Nordic countries were sending countries. But over the last maybe 30 years, they've been, I think all of them, 30 or 40 years, have been mostly immigrant countries, and that's changed things a bit. I mean, like you say, the perception of the Nordic countries as nations and what kind of future do you want to have. So it's kind of caused a bit of a rethinking in some ways. And so doing something like this, the role that immigrants are playing nationally, but certainly also regionally, would be kind of an interesting study to look at their labor market, language, and all sorts of other issues. So.
Yes, hello. Thank you for your talk. My name is Venna Laura. I work for Finland Futures Research Center, and I have 2 points to make a question. I had the opportunity to visit with Tukas this Monday, OECD and UNESCO, and they're keen on working on the futures of work. So what kind of futures research does your entity do? And then my second question and point is, we have this tiny island of Åland, which is belonging to Finland since 1925. And I understand that the diversity, because of people moving into this island because of work, has just expanded. Can you explore this, please?
Yeah. Let me take your second question first. Yeah, I mean, I didn't zoom in on Åland, but Åland has a large foreign-born population. Until recently, it was mostly Swedes, obviously, because it's a Swedish-speaking. But you're right. I mean, it's a small. What is it? 27,000 people. So it's. But you're right, because of certain labor market niches, because of aging of the population, there is kind of a growing foreign population from elsewhere outside of the Nordic countries. I don't know the particulars, but I just know the numbers. And your first question was about the future of work, right?
No, futures research.
Oh, futures research. Okay. I mean, I guess I've kind of looked at it maybe from a demographic point of view. We've looked at population projections, that's kind of quantitative, but certainly the qualitative. We actually have a study coming out on exactly that, the future of work, which we probably didn't get into as much depth on migration as we should have. But I mean, some of the issues around the future of work in the Nordic countries is this whole issue of digitalization and automation, and what jobs are going to be automated out of existence in the future, and what's going to. And those can be at kind of different levels. It's not just the kind of low-level jobs that will be kind of automated, but there's others. And then, this is the part where we didn't do as much as we could have, but certainly how do immigrants fit into that or not fit into that? I mean, Thomas' question about, certainly some of the lower-skilled immigrants, are they going to find a place in these societies going forward in the future? And that's an issue and something to grapple with, certainly.
One thing that I was still wondering was about the so-called, could we say, traditional migration between Nordic countries, migration of Nordic native-born populations. So what's happening now in this big picture, and are these changes in migration and also migration policies somehow impacting also the movements of Nordic populations between Nordic countries? And on the other hand, are there certain trends or flows that are significant at the moment? So where are people moving within Nordic countries at the moment? Mm-hmm. And have they changed these flows somehow?
The flows of Nordic natives to other countries, in terms of numbers, they've stayed about the same. They've just been kind of overwhelmed by these other migration flows, first from the EU accession countries and then these outside. But the numbers of people moving have stayed relatively constant over the last couple decades, and it's the same as kind of before. I mean, a lot of people from Finland moving to Sweden, less people from Norway moving to the others because they kind of don't need to. Certainly in our office, we're about 2/3 Nordic in our office, and we can always recruit people from Finland. We always have a hard time getting somebody from Norway moving there, so that's just one. And in Denmark, we have quite a few people as well, so yeah.
Okay, so I think we will soon have a coffee, but we still have questions. Yes.
I'm Seppo Laakso from Kauppatutkimusta. I would return back to the employment rate difference between foreign-born population and domestic population in Nordic countries. And at least in Finland, there's evidence that the difference also medium level or higher level educated people, or at least in Finland. Also, those foreign background people who have gone to school in Finland and gone to the university in Finland, they still have a lower employment rate, lower income level than the domestic poor population. Can you comment that? And is that the case also in other Scandinavian, Nordic countries?
Yeah, some of the numbers I showed, the chart that I showed is for like, it was a bit crude. It was, all natives, all foreign. So I don't know the details of that. I can only refer you to some of the studies that we've done. I mean, maybe they parse that a little bit more. So let me. Yeah, so I don't know the answer. I can say that. So
I think we have time for one more question, if there is any. Yes, please.
Kia Lundqvist from University of Turku. I just wanted to add some information.
Sure.
Because you talked about Åland, for instance. So Åland Islands has I think you have to consider the history of Åland. They are a seafaring nation, and they have always been very international because of that. So it's very important, I think. And you were asking Maria about migration within the Nordic countries, and at least being part of the Swedish-speaking community here, we are very worried about now young Swedish-speaking people moving to Sweden in quite big masses.
Yes, thank you.
So thank you so much for your active participation and good discussion and for your presentation. And let's thank Timothy Pano.